I began the book fair from having launched QBR, the Black Book Review.
Okay.
Again, as an avid reader, I would read the New York Times Book Review. I would read the New York Review of Books, see what books looked like me more times than not.
Right.
There were none at all because Black writers were not reviewed.
Still just hold her, Mom. No, Mommy, it's me, you know, or, okay, it's Stella.
Right.
And love on her. She felt that obligation to be there, but it wasn't one like it was a difficult obligation. It was one that she loved being there for her.
And I came across a job announcement for what was then called a diversity trainer, where we would be going into the workplace and running workshops on racial awareness. I thought I was perfectly qualified because I was a very nice white person, and that it was, you know, just a simple matter of
done your homework, and you. So this is, I wrote the book for this moment. I wrote the book for people that can go in and see things that a lot of people, that's the ultimate goal. But then I also write the book for, if someone wants to pick up sit on the beach and read a page turner and stay up at night and can't put it down.
My granddaughter, she's a good reader, and so I brought her down to pick out some books with my doggy.
I'm a native New Yorker.
And I'm from DC.
We came from Charlotte, North Carolina.
I'm from Senegal, West Africa.
Oh, it brings the community out. It brings people from all over the world here. It's just a good place to meet and see books.
Some of the great Black authors of our time are here. I mean, poets. I met Maya Angelou last night. I met Sandra Sanchez. I got to meet all kind of prolific writers and poets. So I just feel like I'm in this literary heaven right now.
My book has been out now for roughly a year. I came here from Hampton, Virginia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Milton Corsey, and I am the host of our webinar this evening, where we're going to be discussing with this fantastic panel that we put together, DEI and how we move it forward. Specifically, what we're going to be focusing in on is how do we create a value proposition that will move DEI from a social, from kind of like a social program, to one that's at the center of the business's core strategic interests. Today's webinar is brought to you, as you saw by some of the previous videos, by both Ben Black Excellence Network and the Harlem Book Fair. The Harlem Book Fair is not simply a book fair. It's an opportunity to help us develop our next group of leaders. So please, if you know anyone, if you know young people who love to read, if you love to read, please come out and join us. It's a very, very important event. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be with our panelists, and I'm going to go around and give a quick introduction, and then we're going to jump right into the conversation, right? First up is my dear friend TiAira Neal. She's a member of the National Diversity Council, and she's also the DEI strategist for South Jersey Industries. We have Shanta Eaden, who is the founder and CEO of Founders Edge Consulting. And last, but clearly not least, we have Brian Oglesby, who is the president and CEO of the East Minority Supplier Diversity Network. Panelists, it's great to be with you. You guys can come off mute.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Milton.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation, Milton.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So why don't we jump right on in? And, you know, I had a conversation with each one of you, kind of a priority to us getting together today. And I shared with you the idea of how can we move DEI from a social justice perspective more to a strategic initiative that's at the core of the organization. I guess before I even ask that question, the first thing I should ask is, A, that's a hypothesis I've shared with all of you previously. Do you agree that that's the direction we should move in?
I want to jump in first, so I'll defer. Unless somebody wants me to jump in first.
Well,
Go for it, Brian.
No, Brian, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think it's absolutely essential that we change the value proposition with supplier diversity, is because when we use it when we only rely on the fact that it's the right thing to do, that only lasts as long as the social winds blow in the proper direction. We gained a lot of momentum through the unfortunate passing of George Floyd and the urban unrest that followed. A lot of companies got into a space where they felt like DEI was valuable to them in terms of projecting their social responsibility. But there's always going to be a moment where that wears off, unfortunately, where it shouldn't idealistically, but in a realistic sense that it doesn't wear off. And we have to make sure we're creating a value proposition that insulates ourselves from the undulations of the social consciousness that we tend to have in this place.
Yeah, I would, thanks, Brian. I would add to that is that to me it's right? A lot of organizations are also being tasked with being more socially responsible. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's for that reason also it should align to the business objective. So when we think about ESG, which is in environmental social governance, that S is where DEI typically sits. And so for me, it's, again, not only is the right thing to do, it's good for business. And I hope, I'm also very optimistic. I hope that investors will, as they think about investing in organizations, that they're looking at not just what people are saying in their sustainability reports for ESG, but they're digging deeper to make sure that not only are they doing what they need to for the company culture, but they are also taking care of the communities in which they operate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think of the most recent McKinsey report that showed that in industries or corporations that take a more DE&I focused approach actually move their financial returns upwards to 40%. So, therein lies the support, right? The money is what is a primary motivator for a lot of corporations. And that conversation of moving from the preaching social justice or the proselyte kind of activity that we've seen behind DE&I is now a pendulum swinging action towards a more widened conversation. I think the bigger issue, and I think we're going to talk about this or dig into this a little bit more, is really this challenge between this binary that we've been looking at around race and gender, right? So when we talk about DE&I, sometimes corporations think straight to that race gender piece, but there's a whole widened gap of intersectionality that corporations are not having a conversation around. And employees within corporations are challenging that inclusive perspective that widens that gap beyond the binary of gender and race.
Well, guys, I think we started off with a bang. That's really, really interesting stuff. There's a lot to unpack there. I think, though, what I want to go back to first is something that you said, TiAira, and you talked about kind of like what I would refer to as diversity's dividend, like that there is a real, value proposition when it comes to diversity. In other words, it does add to the bottom line. I guess my question for you, because everybody, all the panelists here work in this field, they deal with this every day. You guys are on the front lines. Do you think that message is actually getting across? Do you think that companies understand and have incorporated that into their thinking?
If I could add, one of the things that leaders will ask for is the production of, and not necessarily think about what is required to build the architecture, right? So leaders may ask for innovation, creativity, best practices, a certain kind of savvy engineering and problem solving that is more readily identified in a more diverse group than it is in a heterogeneous group. And I think that moving beyond the challenge of asking for the proof of it and actually moving towards doing it to show that when you create a more diverse, equitable organization, you will see that the organization itself, can prove its worth. And I think moving beyond also asking for, and I know this is going to get in the weeds, and we're going to start talking about metrics, right? Metrics and KPIs that support this work as a starting point, right? Like, can you start with metrics and then build DE&I? I mean, we've seen DE&I become more robust in the last 5 or so years as a result of the tipping point with George Floyd. But prior to this moment in time, DE&I was more so a one off the side of a desk, right? Or something that was looked at as an HR function and EEO1 data, or some kind of risk analysis through that ESG conversation. But there's a whole lot of complexities in this that kind of show that when leaders look at the connection between innovation, creativity, and problem solving, we can produce a more developed workforce and a more modern workforce, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, I want to add to that a couple stats to the point that was made earlier. So this is from McKinsey and Deloitte. So organizations are 2 times more likely to meet or exceed their financial targets with the diverse and inclusive workforce, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. Right. And so honestly, I don't even like to have the business case discussion anymore, because there's tons of data that's out there. And then even in Gallup's actually provides some great resources around the people aspects. It talks about our workforce is demanding more inclusive cultures workforce. They're looking at websites to see who's on the leadership team, who's on the board, right? So 67% of job applicants value diversity, and they say when they are looking actively or passively, it's important for them to make a decision. So in the era of great resignation and quiet quitting, and just how the globalization of remote work and the competition around work, I mean, organizations have to get smarter about providing cultures that employees actually want to come in and thrive.
Yeah, and I would just add to them, when I engage a corporation and talk about DE&I or any type of diversity-based program, or even incorporating diversity throughout their business modeling, there are 3 questions that are always going to be asked. How much is it going to cost? What is it going to generate? And what am I going to save? Which is a function of the generation. And part of that is, to your point, Shanta, with all the data that's flowing out there that tells you that it's anywhere from 20 to 40% more profitable to have a diverse internal workforce, supply chain, and business partnerships, and also buying relationships. It gets you into a space where you not only have to prepare yourself to engage the outside world in terms of diversity, you have to have upward mobility within your own organization, where you're actually engaging the totality of the marketplace. If we just went with the raw population ratio, if you're only marketing towards 65% of your potential customer base, there leaves 35% that you haven't touched. And that market share is significant. If you can get more than 1/3 of a market share of anything, you're going to have a wildly successful company. And it really comes down to a cultural orientation of the company. If the company really wants to be more profitable, then diversity is a no-brainer. But because of the political winds and the way they massage the language around what diversity means, it doesn't mean you're being usurped. It means that you're including your entire customer base. And part of what I do in my role is to try to generate that level of influence and education, saying this is not something that's a hard sell. If I have to sell this to you, then I'll go to one of your competitors and they'll buy into it and you'll lose in the marketplace. And we can just play the capitalist game. And that profitability insulates us from the social fatigue that people get from talking about these issues and engaging with them. No one gets fatigued to profit. No one. No one will ever say, we're making too much money right now. We need to slow this money-making thing down, regardless of how they're making the extra money.
Yeah, Brian, that's absolutely true. I've yet to hear any client or any colleague say, we're making too much money. We should kind of back off of this thing. So fantastic. It seems like, and please, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that we're all kind of on the same page, that value proposition is a real thing, that it really is the kind of one of the core issues that, one of the core values, I think is a better way to put it, one of the core values that a robust DE&I program can bring to any organization, large or small. And it sounds like from listening to the three of you that that's not falling on deaf ears, that the vast majority of organizations and companies understand this, assuming that there's going to be some who don't. Brian, I see your.
I wouldn't say as easy of a sell this appears to be. I would say it's an easy thing. And someone else, please chime in on this, because I don't want to be the only one saying this, because I can see other people chomping at the bit here. But sometimes, sometimes people don't do things because it makes entirely too much sense to do it. And it belies what their perceptions are and what their beliefs are. So you're diving into someone's comfort zone and their space of belief. You're disproving your own notions and bigotry and isms by engaging in a business practice is going to make you profitable. That's a tough thing to do to yourself if you're so committed to your bigotry. So yeah, so it's not as easy as sell. I don't want the perception to be that we go out into this world and as soon as we give them the statistics, say, okay, we'll go diverse. It doesn't happen that way. It really doesn't.
Yeah. I'm grappling with two things. The first is something that you, Milton, said earlier about DE&I as a program versus DE&I as a cultural business model. And I think that we have the responsibility of moving leaders from looking at DE&I as just a program that is funded versus a way of operation that kind of bleeds into the entire business function from the top all the way throughout. And that goes into what Brian just shared around challenging ideologies. And I think when you think about inbred bigotry versus, thinking about business best practices, those two things kind of contradict each other, right? They should work together. If I have an ideology, or conservative perspective around one particular social group, however, including them is good for the business, and I am a business leader, it just makes sense to include them. However, if I am committed to my bigotry, as Brian has just, kind of mentioned, I'm not going to see the value add because I don't want to see the value add of being inclusive of a particular social group. So now you're talking about individuals who hold ideas, but also are the ones that control the power to the organizational dynamics. So the question then becomes, or not so the question, but the challenge for us who do this work, is how do we break the chains, right? How do we break down the barriers, the gates, the walls to make it make sense to folks that are committed just to not wanting it to make sense?
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. Two things. First off, my apologies for calling the DEI program. You're absolutely positively right. That's the goal, is to make it. And kind of when we open today's program, the idea is how do we make it more strategic? Because you're right, it should never be a program. It's part of one of the things that's at the core of our business model. So I will, from this point forward, for the rest of this hour, I promise not to say program. And if I do, any one of you feel free to virtually slap me to stop from saying that again.
It's a working term, but we know what it is.
Yeah. So, but I know both you, Brian, and TiAira, you guys talked about this idea of people being, I think you used the term bigotry. I'll use, almost intentionally ignorant, right? So
willful blindness.
Yes. Thank you. That's even better. Willful blindness. But because I think there's two subsets of people who can cause challenges that may appear to be the same, but can be fundamentally different. That is people who are, as you just said, willfully blind. And then there's this other subset of people who have an unconscious bias. Like the example that my grandmother used to give all the time when I was a little kid. My grandmother was from North Carolina, so she had a lot of those sayings, those country sayings. She said, a fish always notices the water last, right? Because it lives in that. They don't even notice it. So let's kind of shift, or here's my thought. The people who are intentionally ignorant or who are being bigoted or intentionally biased, that's a much more challenging nut to crack. But those folks who just don't realize what the impacts of their attitudes and presumptions and assumptions have, is there a way that we can begin to kind of peel some of that back and open their eyes and create allies, for lack of a better way to put it. Any thoughts around that?
I'll jump in. I just believe in circling the wagons and attacking the problem from multiple directions. Obviously, you want to educate people, and it's almost a sad that education is being turned into a cliche term. But you want to educate people about what the actual facts are. But we know, as we all know, people reject education. Sometimes you have to sick your allies on people, and sometimes you have to shame people or create competition in other places. I was alluding to going to the next company and saying, if you do this, you can beat out company B. Sometimes you're shaming people into action and shaming the people who surround that person who controls the lever. If you have shareholders for larger corporations, we got to ESG, that turns into a big shareholder relations thing. And if the people who are believers in ESG are primary shareholders in a company, and they see another company performing because of ESG, that creates the pressure to get into these spaces. So with every organization or corporation that we succeed with, it applies pressure to other ones who are losing out in the marketplace. Obviously, people who are immersed in this and have the unconscious bias, you pull a fish out of water, it starts to choke. And the education and the persistence and the, to some degree, agitation pulls people out of the water to see what's happening. But I don't think there's one answer. And I never think there's one answer. I think you attack these problems from multiple angles. You utilize whatever allies you have in place, you utilize whatever tools you have in place in terms of comparative shame. And you try to make sure you repeat the facts enough where the facts become the facts.
I think, working with clients that want to do something, but frankly, sometimes they don't even know how. They don't even know what. It kind of goes back to, just genuinely, they have been a fish. They don't even recognize the environment that's around them. And so, I like to take the approach of one-on-one relationships, creating that level of trust and psychological safety where we can have conversations to expand their thinking. And so again, it depends. Everything depends on who you're talking to, what type of engagement you're about to have with them. But when I have leaders that are asking questions and being curious about, maybe even questioning what shows up in the political noise, they want to do something. And so to me, those are the people I want to talk to, right? Those are the people that my organization likes to engage with, because they're leaning into this, even if they don't know, and then they want the experts to come in and help them to try to make some progress in there for their organizations. And I think there's enough of those where we can really see change, and the resistors are going to be the resistors. And frankly, I'm not going to waste my energy on them.
I'd like to add to that, sure. Just going back to Brian's thought about the multidisciplinary approach. I think in doing this work, we do best to equip practitioners and strategists who do this work to take on a certain sense of cultural intelligence, in that every environment you operate in is going to look different. DE&I maturity across organizations and industries is going to look different. Appetites will look different. Leadership, because of their personalities and their own ideas, is going to look different. And I would say that, some organizations who perceive themselves to be further along may be the most difficult to move forward because they think they're already there, right? And then there are some organizations who naturally have a compassionate nature due to the kind of leadership they have in place, who will move a lot further because they're already doing the work. They just haven't named it. And then going back to that KPI and metrics, right? They just need something to kind of prove outwardly that this is the work that they've done, and how to step forward. So like, Brian said, and sorry, Brian, I keep agreeing with you, There is a multi-tiered approach to looking at a lot of this, and there's no one size fits all. Just as diverse as the work that we engage in, that's why so many of us are needed. Like, this industry is such a vast one, and there's so much room, right? Like, I'm gonna lean into my faith space that says the laborers are few, but the work is plentiful, right? There's a lot of work to be done, in this industry. And I think the other part of this is, all of us have a tone and tenor in the way that we operate this work, and a certain kind of genius that we all operate in, that we can utilize from our diverse vantage points to create change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, you guys, for sharing that. I think the conversation is going fantastic so far. But I am going to come back to something that was mentioned earlier. I think when we started the conversation off, we started talking about, kind of what are some of the measurables? What are some of the returns? We talked about some of the McKinsey reports that say, hey, we're going to do, here's what the dividend looks like. Here's kind of what happens. Are there particular metrics? Are there particular KPIs? I'm an old finance guy by training, and that stuff always warms my heart. That's the language I speak, right? So what are some of the measures or some of the KPIs that we can use to say that A, we're making progress, and B, we can correlate this progress, the growth that we're having as an organization, to our efforts around diversity? Any thoughts?
Not going first on this one this time.
Let's see, we've kind of had a rhythm going, Brian. You kind of always go first.
Right. That's right.
I feel so rude going first every time. So I think one of the fundamental errors we make in assessing success is that we measure impact. We do input 1 minus impact 2 equals a number. Like, we spent $50 million this year, and we spent $51 million the next year. So our impact is plus $1 million. Whereas we have to, I'm always going to speak to a variety of factors and being nuanced in my measurements and evaluating organizations very much like fingerprints in their own uniqueness and where they are in that space. To TiAira's earlier point about a company that has a very mature process, that they become jealous of that process to the point where they don't think it needs to be improved. But they're doing greater numbers than the company that has just started and is beginning to I'll just speak to my space, onboarding diverse suppliers at a much higher clip and a higher percentage than that company with a mature process. So the performance indicators are as unique as the companies. Obviously, we have guidelines in terms of workforce requirements for particular projects held down by federal sources, municipal sources, statewide sources, and the like. Then we have companies that have their own internal goals. But where I don't think we do a good job is coming up with a unique and nuanced measurement for that company that's inherent in their strategic or business planning. That says, relative to where we are today, how do we get to tomorrow? I think there's so much emphasis on just impact. There's not as much impact on that emphasis on that impact versus the actual return on investment. How much is that? What did it cost me to generate that $50 million worth of spend? And how did that impact my overall bottom line? Again, the studies are out there, but for individual companies, I don't think they do a deep enough dive saying, what are my dollars going to get me when I get into this DEI space? What is my impact when I have internal people in my own staff? And I won't go into my whole story about what I consider to be a hold-up person that saves people lots of money because they don't cost organizations don't cost themselves money with bad diversity decisions. But I think it's just long answer shortened. I think companies don't do an effective enough job of diving in deep or utilizing people that can help them do it and teach them how to do it, because obviously there's a lot of people that don't do it very well. But yeah, I think it's just a space where your fingerprint, you have to decide what the impact is going to be and then measure yourself against that measure of impact.
Thanks. Anyone else have any?
I do. I don't want to follow the same cadence we've been. So, Shanta, if you want to share.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with Brian, actually. So, I mean, if you think about if you're approaching DEI as a strategy, anytime you do any other business strategy, you would always think about what are our outcomes or how are we going to measure our success. So if you think about it from that approach, based on what your outcomes are, your objectives are, then businesses should be thinking about, okay, what are the things that's going to tell us if we're successful? And a lot of times also those measurements don't show up right away because you're making long-term sustainable change. Mm-hmm. Some of the things I think are table stakes, is you should be tracking, your percentage of women by and minorities, women and minorities by grade level, your promotion velocity for underrepresented groups, who's in technical versus non-technical roles, who's moving up the ranks, attrition rates, and then break that attrition rate down by, again, women, minorities, and maybe even other groups that veterans that you might be tracking. And so there's just different ways to do it. I also think that if companies are doing quote unquote engagement surveys, that's a great way to include some questions around inclusion so that you could measure how people feel working there. And I do think those inclusion questions are different than your typical engagement questions as well. So that's just some of the things that come to mind when you're trying to put together some of the things. But I think it really depends on what are the objectives that we're trying to achieve, and then create your metrics from there.
I think another space that I've kind of, had some firsthand, work with is employee resource groups. Employee resource groups are natural drivers for diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement, and have a natural sway with corporations and at various levels. They are also the place that operates the most creatively, within organizations, because they don't have the same stringent policies that kind of counter the ways that, we may have some barriers in operation. And some of the KPIs is just, employee participation, driving leadership to actually, be involved with employee resource groups, executive sponsors, heading those spaces to have more engagement with them. And then they have more leverage to produce a more qualitative outcome for employees that kind of spell out what's happening within the organization from a more free-flowing conversation as to some of the challenges. Employee resource groups, when you spend time with them, tend to build themselves to remedy what they don't see within the organization. And so how they galvanize is really around some of those gaps that the organization itself may not be filling from a professional and business level. So those are places to really spend some time building some performance indicators around. Over the course of the last couple of years, I've been able to look at employee resource groups growth as a performance measure. So, who gets involved, how they get involved. If you have a union workforce, is your union workforce involved? Why or why not, right? And then even using the diverse supplier pipeline through the ERG. So that particular area usually touches almost every individual in my current workforce.
So that's I think you're spot on, TiAira, because I actually think that ERGs are underutilized resource when you think about fostering the inclusive culture that you want, because they a lot of times create the energy that's needed, that bubbles at the top, right? At the bottom into the top, right? And so even if you don't have, your executive team, the entire executive team fully on board, they'll start feeling the pressure from the energy that the ERGs are creating. And so I've seen where, organizations that didn't have them, and we actually set up the ERGs and just the difference that it made in culture. So I think there's definitely a secret weapon for organizations. On the flip side of that, I think executive CHROs or CDOs especially too have to be careful not to make your ERGs your DEIB strategy, right? They should not carry the burden of change shifting culture because there's a lack of an organization or enterprise strategy around DEIB.
I also want to add the other thought I had around just the KPIs is that sometimes it becomes dangerous to operationalize DEI with metrics, right? So it goes back to that prove it, right? But you want to be careful that you're not asking employees to prove what should be done, right? Because if you constantly go back to that measure of prove it, and you've not done that historically with some of the grassroots parts of your businesses, that gets into the weed of another kind of social political conversation of what groups you're charging to prove and who you're holding accountable versus who you're not holding accountable. And you know, that equity conversation then comes, it pivots in a different direction.
And I mean, and it's part of a normal business cycle to have a funnel of investment this big that leads to a product this small that generates a piece of revenue this big. And that bigger funnel at the beginning is all the ideas that go into that product that fail. And when it gets to be this narrow, you get to the spaces where they succeed, and then you get through that tunnel and you get the profitability and the desired results. We have to be careful when we talk about DEI that we don't take this away, because there has to be an opportunity and space to experiment and fail a little to get the product that you need that's going to give you the result. The tendency is DEI effort. We I'll use my work as an example. We onboarded a diverse supplier. They didn't do very well. We're not going back to another diverse supplier. And you have to be and I don't like to use the word intentional. I like to use the word deliberate. You have to deliberately have that same product development funnel as a business methodology for DEI as you would trying to make a flavored toothpaste, for example, and get down to those products that, WD-40 is water displacement 40 because it's the 40th attempt to create a spray that can make things not squeak. They failed 40 times. So you have to have the ability to allow DEI to stutter along as opposed to having this perfect product that gives you the perfect results that you can put out in the press conference or put me on the cover of a brochure and saying we're diverse. You have to be able to create something that's going to whittle down to something tight and then create that end product that you want: profitability, high level participation, higher elevation of people into the C-suite, people of color into the C-suite, higher level diverse spend, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
First of all, I love the way Brian always refers to numbers, so I'm digging that. I also think we talked about accountability a little bit. I think equipping those managers, so maybe participation rate. I was thinking about one more metric that comes up a lot. Participation rates around training and education of people managers is also another metric, really, because you can't hold people accountable if you haven't equipped them properly. And so again, if the goal is accountability, you could track that for a period of time to see, okay, are we equipping our managers in the right way as well.
Yeah, this is a great conversation, guys. I really appreciate it. Some really wonderful ideas, I think, that are coming. I know we have people in the queue waiting to ask some questions, but before we get to the audience, I do have one final question I'd like to ask the panel and kind of see what your thoughts are around this. At the beginning of the conversation, I don't recall who it was who talked about, the Great Resignation, and now we're in this great war for talent. And I guess I'd ask you guys to share with us how having DEI or having DEI at the core of our organizations from a strategic perspective, how can that add value, or how can that create an environment where people want to come, they want to stay versus leave?
Not answering first, no.
I'm going to call on somebody this time, Brian. I'm not going to make you lead off. Let's say eeny, meeny, miny, mo. We're going to start with TiAira. What do you think?
Yeah. I guess, my mind goes naturally to one of the things, and please forgive my sociologist background, but one of the things that COVID did for us is it gave us a lot of choices that we didn't realize we had prior to it, right? It changed our attitude around our choices entirely. And so while you saw a lot of folk kind of, leaving their organizations about a year later, some of those same folk, are circling back. But they're circling back looking for specific things that are attractive to whatever it is that their needs were. Prior to COVID, it was, I have to have this job because I have to pay my bills. Now it's, I've learned work-life balance, I've learned wellness, and I need a job that's going to facilitate the inclusion of whatever I perceive as my values in terms of wellness are. And so organizations who kind of have been able to create this kind of culture that's thoughtful and people-centered are the organizations where the top talent are going to be driven to. Organizations who are still kind of in that same space or try to go back to the way things were and have not changed anything just because they didn't see it broken, are going to get the, those, let me be careful with what I say, what's left over, right? And what's left over is not always the most diverse, right? It may be those traditional conservative workers that are not going to think innovatively. They're not going to be creative. They're just working to work, right? And maybe are shifting into the retirement stages if they did not remain in the organization. We also see the conversation around intergenerational diversity now coming to the forefront more than we have. One of the things that we notice across each generation is an ideology that's associated with the way each of those generations work. What COVID did was make those ideologies more prevalent in the workforce. And as a result of that, each of those ideologies are now looking for something specific. An organization that will thrive now is going to look at what those ideologies are and create best practices to be inclusive of those ideologies. If not, organizations will run the risk of having less of a certain intergenerational group.
Shanta, Brian, any thoughts?
Okay, I'll go next. What TiAira said, first of all. And secondly, I don't even call it the Great Resignation. I call it the Great Recalibration, because we have a lot of things that are going on in the workplace that are being remedied. One of the silver linings of an otherwise awful cloud of COVID is people working at home became more productive. They were handling those 15-minute emergencies at home in 15 minutes rather than taking a half a day off. People who were going from meeting to meeting suddenly had 6 meetings in a day instead of 3. So there's this counterbalancing of, I have greater work-life balance and I'm more productive and I can work anywhere on earth now. And that opens up the options. And when we talk about DEI, now we're getting into a global marketplace where the workplace norms and mores are different. As a consultant, I've had European clients that didn't want me to work above 10 hours just because they don't believe in that much time being used. So this recalibration and also not to mention the fact that we're about 40 years behind in wage growth for the average American worker. This recalibration has caused people to get into a new space where their level of tolerance for menial work or menial pay or lack of benefits or a workplace environment that's diverse and reflects the type of life they want to live, not just the job that they have. And there's a silent revolt amongst people who are doing the hiring, largely driven by the fact that they have a lot of real estate they're still paying for, and they have to justify those payments because those leases didn't get cut back. But also, it's a control-based environment, because the closer you have that person to the desk, the more you can control their ambitions. But if I'm sitting in my office and I have a spare moment to look at my cell phone to my right, on Indeed, maybe there's a job that's equivalent to what I'm doing that pays me twice as much. So you actually have to earn your employees now. And I really love how the younger generation, they, as much as people lament the fact that they do this quiet quitting stuff, it's a beautiful thing because it puts a lot of pressure on a company that's seeking out diversity, that's seeking out market penetration to a younger market, that's seeking knowledge transfer from from older workers to younger workers as the aging workforce moves on with no replacements. This recalibration has set off a whole chain of events that DEI can manage, at this focal point of managing, both in a local and a global marketplace.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Shanta, do you have anything or? Okay, no worries, no worries. Well, listen, this conversation going on forever, but I do want to give the audience a chance to ask us any questions that they might have. So I think the easiest way to handle this is if you could go to look on your screen, you'll see a raised hand. If you could just click there, and then we'll make sure that we are available to answer your question.
Milton, there's also I believe there's some Q&A questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I do see those. I'm going to take a quick look and see what we have.
The conversation, it might be good to throw those out there too, but I do see a raised hand.
Yeah, one of the questions in the Q&A chat box was, we're asking, A says great conversation. They love the kind of the emphasis, at least initially, on the idea of how do we tie DEI to the bottom line? So they like that idea, but they're also interested in about how do we create the infrastructure or the support within organizations so that diverse people don't just come in and stay at lower levels, but are able to continue to bubble up to the very tops of the organizations.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, so a couple of things. One, I think, again, if you're approaching this as how do we integrate DEI into our culture, then one of the things that you would look at is your learning and development programs. And what learning and development programs are you doing for the organization as a whole? But I also have seen organizations that have reviewed the demographic or the makeup or for the people that are participating in those programs to see if they're reaching the right people in order to really make those programs, favorable for a diverse population. They've leveraged their ERG resource groups, the employee resource groups, in order to be able to also promote those mentorship programs. And organizations I work with too, we've created sponsorship programs, which means that you have somebody advocating for you to grow, to get into that leadership pipeline. And so again, as they're being deliberate, like Brian says, about feeding the pipeline with diverse candidates and diverse leaders, they're looking at those programs and they're trying to make sure that they are pulling in those high potentials, those high performers that or of a diverse background in order to be able to help them get promoted. So those are some of the programs I've seen.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thanks for sharing. It looks like we have our first question. Mr. Bennett, if you would, you can unmute and ask your question.
I'm in the workforce development market space, and thank you for all of your professional input. And I address corporations on a regular basis, but we have a huge issue that deals with workforce development and skills shortages in the corporate space. My question is, what type of employee resource programs do you find impactful in the DE&I space to address skill shortage and development?
Go for it, Brian.
No. You please go.
So one of the things that comes to mind in my space, and I'm in the utility space, we have a lot of partnerships with chambers who do this work intentionally and create a pipeline into the organization. The chambers, what they do is an annual collection of information from workforce development groups to create an access pipeline and tons of work to eliminate barriers and then funnel into organizations like mine. There's also grassroots kind of connected, I know, and I don't know what area everyone's in, and I won't call out any companies, but specific companies will create their own skills development gap programs where they're intentionally recruiting diverse employees, giving them the skills that's needed and training them in that particular area. Also looking at their work or time, maybe as an apprentice, and creating apprenticeship opportunities to train them to intentionally kind of create space for them within the organization that I'm in.
Yeah, and Robert, as a former workforce investment guy, one of the things I've always been a big fan of is utilizing the workforce investment system as a means of training the next generation of employees in a variety of trades. I mean, obviously they prioritize their dollars and high occupation things that are growing in terms of I forget the terminology, but they have OJT dollars and ITA and things like that that companies could actually utilize. And I've seen companies discover workforce and investment dollars that they can use to subsidize their training costs, so they can onboard people and entice people into those relationships with older workers and maturing workers who are aging out to transfer that knowledge, and then have that training subsidized, creating their own training plans that are customized to their employment workspace. And even if you're not using workforce dollars, the thing that I always encourage companies to do is to come up with your own customized training and knowledge transfer program. And then by extension, utilize your HR department to recruit in diverse spaces. If need be, if it's a college educated environment, need be, go to an HBCU and make sure you put a table up at the job fair to recruit people. Make sure you have a liaison internally to make sure when a diverse person or person of color comes into a workplace, they don't feel completely alone and isolated. And develop external mentorship with retired executives or senior executives from other companies that may assist people in making those transitions to the point where you're sequentially building out a diverse workforce where the next cohort of people that come in don't feel so isolated. Because a lot of times, companies I've worked with as a consultant, they're very deliberate about getting diverse people in, but what happens is they walk into the door and they're the only one in the room. And then they wind up going to a bigger company that has a more diverse workforce. So we have to be able to utilize all the tools in the environment, and companies really have to be deliberate about training people to get into these spaces and transfer this knowledge to the diverse population that reflects the community that they're in and doing business in, and the customer base that they're trying to get into.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, Brian. Shanta, anything or? Okay, I have one idea I like to add to this, since I haven't been talking very much, but there's one thing I would like to share, and that is, I think it's important for hiring managers wherever possible to really start looking at competencies versus credentials, right? Oftentimes people will get eliminated from consideration because they might not have a specific credential. And in certain instances, the credentials are vital and they're important. But there are oftentimes situations where the credential can simply be a placeholder. Brian talked about the idea of, having a college degree, and HBCUs are fantastic organizations. They've trained some of our best and brightest and some of our greatest leaders. But everybody is not going to be college material. Some people, but they might still have a skill set that's functional. We just need to be able to take a look at that. Now, there are a few other questions I see in a Q&A. I'm going to ask those to our group as well. And Ronald Ronald says that he's involved in developing DE&I channels with workforce investment funds. So what suggestions can you share to assist in developing assessments to leverage the use of workforce investment funding? In other words, how can we use that money in the best way? Any thoughts?
Essentially, you go to your local workforce investment board or entity, and you try to, they're very much about giving out, what is it called? I'm drawing a blank here, but the training funds, they're ITAs and OJT dollars. And they will subsidize employment up to, in some cases 90%, depending on the occupation, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. And they generally have difficulty giving away the money. They're doing huge spend downs into the year, and there's 3 or 4 companies that come in and ask for it. And it's a relatively easy process where you have to submit a training plan, get it approved, do a site visit to make sure it's a legitimate place of business. And you onboard people, and you're not even obligated to keep the people who you onboard throughout this process. And because if they don't work out, you bring someone else in. But I think people need to kind of understand what resources are available in the environment. Workforce investment boards are great places to show up. In Philadelphia region, it's Philadelphia Works, with their corresponding workforce investment boards in every county in America. And they all have some measure of OJT dollars on the table that they can utilize to train people into occupations that are higher paying or have an upside to them, and giving people an opportunity to grow. You can mimic that process internally just by putting into a job description for a senior leader that they have to train the next generation. There's nothing against you adding something to a job description. Everyone has other duties as assigned on their job description anyway. So you try to make knowledge transfer part of culture, peer mentorship part of the culture, senior to junior mentorship part of the culture. If it's within your means, you bring in a consultant to mentor people into these positions and jobs, because workforce is an investment. If you're trying to get a workforce that's by passively waiting for the right person to show up, you're not really doing good business. And you have to utilize the resources to help subsidize or buttress your own work internally. And it's really based on deliberate policymaking, deliberate business practices, and deliberate growth strategies involving your workforce.
Brian, thank you so much for sharing. There was one final question in our Q&A, and that was, it was from Joanne Meyer. Joanne was asking, how can we help leaders become aware? Like, you remember at the beginning of the conversation, we had the fish notice the waters last. I gave that example. Our fish doesn't really even know that they're in water. How can we help, that senior executive or that mid-level manager, or that frontline supervisor, become more curious and aware of things that are outside of their natural comfort zone? Is there any tips we might be able to give, to be honest, about how we might be able to do that?
For me, the thing that's worked the most effectively is, a conversation. One, if you're an opportunity to have just one-on-one interactions with them, but also training in such a way that people don't feel talked at, but they're learning, and they're expanding their thinking, and we're understanding the different preferences and ideas and experiences of each other. Usually when you approach training in that way, then many times after training, people say, that was nothing like what I thought, right? And then they come out more understanding of what DE&I even is. And so just creating a space where people could be safe to learn is where I've seen has been the most effective.
Yeah, I think to add to that, one of the things that comes to mind is check the temperature of the organization. Power dynamics vary from organizations and industry to industry. There are some, senior leaders who will naturally lean into humanity and compassion and really want to know at the ground level what's happening, all the way throughout the organization. And there are some leaders who enjoy the hierarchy, at the position that they're at. Given that thought process, though, that's where your advocates come in, and understanding the relationship between the advocates and having the advocates kind of pull them along. But the temperature within each organization is going to vary. I find, and I'll share a little secret, I guess this is anecdotal. One of the things that I was able to do in our organization is create these conversations that we call coffee chats. Other organizations call them something else. We have invited our leaders to share in those spaces where we have small breakout groups. The power in that is that leaders are sharing their own challenges and transgressions in connection to what our employee and workforce is sharing as well. There's a synergy that happens there that comes by way of things like, I didn't know, right? And that particular leader then takes that thought process back to their space, and they feel the need to do something overall about it. Maybe not then and there, but there's a resonance that happens in their thought processing where, they may check back, or they may create more access to having conversations and connection like that. We can't forget that at the end of the day, human beings desire human connection, and human connection really drives innovation. Through some research and data, we've seen that intercultural connections, intercultural relationships actually produce better business outcomes and business practices.
Yes, absolutely. Brian, anything for us?
I think they've said it very eloquently, but I'll give the Jedi mind trick approach. Sometimes you have to convince somebody it's their idea. Sometimes you have to convince someone, something you said to me inspired me. to think of this idea and give them ownership of the good idea. And this is, very much a very relationship and organic based thing where you really have to try to drill the message home in multiple ways. And, when someone is recalcitrant in their approach or still stuck in that water, you have to convince them there was their idea to jump out of it a lot of times. So sometimes it's a lot more effort than it should be. And it's the other answers are much more refereed approaches, but sometimes you just have to convince someone that that your idea is theirs, and then they run with it and they can shine a little bit. It's not very sophisticated, but sometimes it works.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Listen, panel, believe it or not, we're at the top of the hour. It's time for this conversation to end. I really, really appreciate speaking with each of you. I think that you all really provided some real pearls of wisdom for the audience. And I'm going to ask each of you to come back, because I think there's so much more ground to cover. I'd love to have all of you come back again. Again, thank you to the audience for coming in, sharing this hour with us. Hopefully you were able to take away, Brian did the old politician wave. Hopefully that you found this hour to be useful and helpful. Appreciate our sponsors, Ben, and our sponsor, the Harlem Book Fair. Remember, a book is the door to the world. Leaders are readers. So please attend the Harlem Book Fair. Looking forward to seeing you all there. Take care.
Right. And this is American Sign Language applause, by the way.
Oh, thank you for correcting me, Brian. Take care, everyone.